Hello, I'm Desiree Schumann. I'm with the St. Louis County Library and the Youth Services Department. Our event today is part of the St. Louis Teen Book Festival, sponsored by the St. Louis County Library, HEC Media, and the Novel Neighbor Bookstore. We're hosting over 40 of the hottest young adult writers. The St. Louis Teen Book Fest is 11 days of programming dedicated to connecting teen readers with the diverse group of popular writers. You can order all of our authors' books from our indie bookstore partner, The Novel Neighbor, at thenovelneighbor.com. They are also offering special discounts if you purchase a bundle of all of the featured books on this panel. I'm really excited to host these 4 incredibly talented authors in young adult fantasy: Hafsah Faizal, Kiersten White, Gavriel Savit, Julia Ember. Our authors' new books all feature amazing world building and unforgettable characters. Welcome, everyone. So let's start. Hafsah, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us about your book, We Hunt the Flame.
Hello, I am Hafsah Faizal, and I'm the author of We Hunt the Flame and its sequel, We Free the Stars, which released earlier this year. And the books are set in a world inspired by Ancient Arabia, where a girl named Zafira ventures to this villainous island where she has to retrieve a lost artifact that can save her dying world. And at the same time, we have the Prince of the Kingdom, who is sent on a similar mission to find her, kill her off, and steal the artifact for his father, the autocratic Sultan. But of course, when their paths cross on the island, that is not exactly what goes down, and they discover an ancient evil brewing that they might have to join forces to defeat. So the sequel picks up where the first book left off, and it basically ties everything together while leaving a few loose threads because I cannot say goodbye to these characters. And I'm currently working on a new book, a new duology, that is actually set in an expanded universe and features vampires, a heist, and a tea room that doubles as a bloodhouse.
Wow. All right. Kiersten, you're next. Tell us about Camelot Betrayal.
Hi, I'm Kiersten White. I am the author of 17 books for young readers. The most recent are The Guinevere Deception and The Camelot Betrayal. These are the first 2 books in a new trilogy called the Camelot Rising Trilogy that is set in Camelot. I've always really loved Arthurian tales. I love the romance and the magic and the drama, but I found a lot of the traditional tales tended to give women not a lot to do except for die tragically. Not a fan of dying tragically. And so I thought I would revisit Camelot and this time focus on the women of Camelot, particularly Guinevere. So in these stories, Guinevere is not just some princess who comes and marries the king and then eventually ruins everything. She is in fact a changeling sent by Merlin to be Arthur's magical bodyguard. But when she doesn't even really understand who she is, how can she trust anyone around her or herself to make the right choices? It's a fun series. It's sweeping. It's magical. It's romantic. There's a dragon. I mean, really, what else do you need?
Nothing. You need nothing else. Gavriel, tell us about The Way Back.
My name is Gavriel Savit, and this is my most recent novel, The Way Back. It is a spooky adventure that follows 2 young people from their little Jewish shtetl of Tupik in Eastern Europe in the 19th century through what I call the Far Country, which is a loose translation of a Yiddish term, Jenewelt, which means that place over there, which is where all the demons hang out. So they're spinning off on this sort of wild journey when the angel of death comes walking through their little village one night, and they both have very personal encounters with them, and their travels lead them deep into the far country to the doorstep of death itself, and then they gotta do their best to find the way back.
Excellent. Julia, how about Ruinsong?
Yeah, hi, I'm Julia Ember. My most recent book is Ruinsong, which is up there. It is a queer high fantasy retelling of the Phantom of the Opera. And it is a standalone. It is set in a world where magic is performed as song, and it follows 2 main characters who are on opposite sides of a national conflict. The first is Cadence, who is a mage and who has been forced into becoming the weapon of the country's really tyrannical queen. And the second is Remy, who is a noble woman whose parents are rebelling against the queen. They were childhood friends in the time, the before era, before the queen came to power. And they are reunited when the queen arrests Remy and uses her as leverage against Cadence. It's a slow burn romance over the course of the book. Their long-held friendship deepens into a sapphic romance, and together they try to overthrow the queen.
Excellent. All right, I'm going to throw out a, let's just say a nice little icebreaker question for you. And the question I have is, and Hafsah, we'll start with you first. Did you choose this genre or did this genre choose you?
Okay, so I started writing when I was 17, and that was sort of the time when I got back into reading. And I'm going to sound really dumb, but I didn't know anything about genre. I was writing science fiction, and I didn't even know I was writing science fiction. And then I thought, you know what, this science fiction is boring. I kind of need some more magic in here. And then this Beyond the Flame became my 5th manuscript. It was my last attempt at publication. And I had this list of stuff that I wanted to write one day. And I thought, this is going to be my last attempt. I might as well throw everything in there. And afterwards, I realized that what I was writing was fantasy. And it was my first time writing fantasy. And despite it being my first, and despite only then discovering that I was writing fantasy, I had always loved it. Mostly because I shied away from picking up contemporary because it was always such a big reminder of how different I was in the real world. And so I thought I enjoyed fantasy because it's this place where so many of us cannot relate to the world. There's dragons and then riding off into the distance on your horse, and it's like people can't relate to that. And so it felt like a place that was more welcoming to me. So I guess, I don't know, I guess we both chose each other.
A nice match. How about you, Kiersten? Did you choose fantasy or did it choose you?
I'm kind of a notorious genre hopper. I mean, I've written thrillers with a sci-fi element. I've written historical fiction retellings. I've written straight retellings. I've written really just kind of all over the place because I just love genre in general. I love the power of genre to tell a true story, but to tell it at an angle so that certain things are heightened and certain things are obscured. So you can explore very real issues, very real emotions, but with that lens of genre to sort of give you both that distance and that magnification at the same time, and it's sort of magical that way, which fits with this. With the Camelot Rising trilogy, I did very specifically choose fantasy. I was coming off of writing a historical fiction trilogy, which was so much more work than I ever knew it was going to be. If I had had any idea how hard historical fiction was to write, I definitely would not have tried. And I just wanted a break. I wanted a break in somewhere magical and romantic. If I came across a problem in the world, I didn't want to have to do 400 pages of research on medieval glassmaking techniques in order to be able to answer the question. I want to be able to say magic. And while magic systems have to make sense, right? They have to be structured. There is a certain leeway there where you can make the magic system fit your world rather than trying to make your story fit into an existing world. So it was definitely fun. It was definitely a very deliberate choice at that point in my writing career to take a nice vacation in Camelot.
How about you, Gavriel?
Well, for me, I guess it's a little bit of both. I also, like Hafsah, started out kind of writing what interested me and ended up finding out that what interests me is magic. Now, I think there's magic everywhere. I have a hard time figuring out how most of the Western canon isn't fantasy to begin with. I mean, almost all of the stories that we transmit from generation to generation have some sort of heightened moment that strays beyond what people might think of as like very journalistic depictions of lived reality. But then in terms of the way back, again, much like Hafsah, I was interested in exploring Jewish magic specifically, which is doubly unfamiliar for a lot of people, right? You gotta introduce them to the magic, and then you also gotta introduce them to the culture from which it comes. But if you're writing them hand in hand, then that introduction can all get rolled into one, right? Like, so many readers might not be familiar with names like Moshe David Frumkin, right? But they also probably weren't really particularly familiar with Legolas as a name either. So it's a really nice opportunity to sort of mix in the history and the culture and the tradition with the fireworks and the fantasy.
Excellent. How about you, Julia?
Well, for me, I've always been a fantasy reader, fantasy and historical fiction, just because I'm a very escapist reader and I like to kind of get outside of our world. But in terms of starting to write it, it was almost an accident because when I graduated from college, I originally thought that I wanted to be an academic and a historian. So I went to graduate school and I studied the medieval period, specifically in Britain and in Scandinavia. So a lot of Vikings and the Anglo-Saxon period. And then about 3 years into being into graduate school, I realized that I really didn't want to be an academic. And the world of academia wasn't for me, and teaching wasn't really for me. And so I got out of that and I started working in publishing, but I still had 3 years of a graduate degree. And I was like, I'm not going to waste this, like this research, like I have to do something with it. So my first duology was Norse mythology inspired. And I just sort of packed it with all kinds of like random research snippets that I had kind of taken from my degree. And through that, I kind of fell in love with writing fantasy.
Very cool. So let me ask each of you a different question. And if you like the question that I ask a different author, you can totally answer that one as well. But Hafsah, I'm going to start with you first. Just what is the biggest distraction that keeps you from writing?
Oh, the voices in my head. And this doesn't mean the character voices. It means like all of these insecurities that come with writing. I feel like before I got published, I was very confident in myself. And then after my book came out, it was like I had carved out a piece of my soul and set it out there. And suddenly everyone was like picking at it like crows. And so I was having a hard time like getting back into myself to write. And so my sequel took so long to write because there were just all of these voices that I didn't know how to silence, because I knew when you're writing your first book, you're kind of writing in a vacuum. You're knowing that you just have to please one agent, and then everything just goes from there, and we'll see how it goes. And so with the sequel, especially a contracted sequel, it's like I know I have to please my agent. I have to please my editors, who are going to pick at it the way they picked at my first book, and now I know how they pick at it. And then I have to please readers, because not just the readers who enjoyed the first book, but the readers who didn't really enjoy the first book, and they're going to pick up the sequel anyway, and critics and booksellers. And now that you've kind of experienced the whole thing, it was really hard for me to come to terms with all of that. I mean, it was exciting knowing that I'm getting paid to write this, but that comes with its own pressures. Like, you know that it has to be worth it. And so, yeah, it was listening to those voices and then trying to silence them and trying to remind myself that I've done this once and I can do it again. That was very, very hard to remember.
Kiersten, what was the most difficult thing, or what is the most difficult thing about retelling stories that people are already familiar with?
Yeah, I mean, I've done several retellings. I really enjoy them. But the most difficult part is what is also the benefit of writing retellings, right? It's that familiarity. So you have to deal with people's baseline of familiarity and either build on it or subvert it. But either way, you're coming in with a new story and you're challenging what they already know and feel about the original. Which is part of why writing Arthuriana is really fun, because there is no canon in Arthurian legend, no matter what anybody says. It's always just been communal storytelling. It's been somebody saw an account of a battle and they liked the name Arthur, so they wrote a poem about him, and somebody read that poem and they liked it, so they wrote a poem, and somebody read that poem and they liked it, so they wrote an epic, but they added a few extra knights because it didn't have enough knights, and so on and so forth. Lancelot doesn't come in for several hundred years. There's all sorts of things that happen over the course of hundreds of years of community storytelling. So you're participating and playing in this like vast playground of just characters and playing with archetypes. And so for me, the biggest challenge is always grounding readers in my version of the world and saying, yes, I know you know who Arthur is, you know who Guinevere is, you know who Lancelot and Merlin are, but here's who they are now. Here's who they are here. And so yeah, it's that you build on what's there, but then you also have to pick the specific points to subvert. Like, oh, you think Merlin is good. Well, let me tell you these things that he did. How do you view him now? Or, oh, my main character thinks this character is good, but now she's seeing these things. She's seeing the reality behind the stories that she's been told. What does she think now? And so that constant engagement in that sort of conversation that you have with the original is both the most difficult but also the most rewarding and thrilling part of writing retellings, is you get to engage in a whole new way with stories that you love but that you also find severely lacking.
Gavriel, you actually, I saw you make a playlist for every project that you do. What does that do for you? Why do you do that?
Yes, I do. It's some of the most exciting time I spend working on a project. The very first thing I do is I start assembling a playlist. It does a lot for me. Firstly, it sort of helps me define the feel and the atmosphere of a piece before I have to get too detailed about, specific settings or characters or anything like that. So it helps me feel the piece before I've written, which is really, really wonderfully helpful. I use it as a sort of like Pavlov's bell for myself. I put on the playlist when I sit down to write each time, and it sort of helps me slip into the world that I'm playing with. And then interestingly, I find that I also, if I'm having trouble with the writing, if I'm stuck on the writing and I don't know what to do or where to go, often I can shake things loose by playing around with the playlist, by going back and saying, okay, what's missing here from what I'm now envisioning, or what's here that feels like it's extra? What do I want to skip every time it comes on? And it sort of helps me reorganize the ideas in a different format. So yeah, no, my playlists are my secret weapon. I love them a lot. And if you're interested, you can find all of them on my website, gavrielsavit.com.
Julia, you write for games as well, right?
Yeah.
So how is writing for a game different than writing a full-out novel prose?
I mean, I would say the biggest difference is in games writing, you're writing a lot of the time with a team. So you're writing like snippets of a larger story, maybe more similar to like how they write TV shows, where there's a team of writers and people, you have an overarching storyboard, but you're sort of filling in gaps and kind of counting on your teammates to fill in the rest, which is a really different process to writing a novel, which is kind of a solitary pursuit. Even if you have a lot of critique partners and writing friends, like ultimately all of the pressure for getting the novel on the page is on you. And you don't have quite the same ability to bounce ideas off of other people that you do with game writing, where you're constantly asking your team members, like, what do you think about this subplot? Or what do you think about this quest? With a novel, you're kind of floundering through the wilderness on your own, especially in the first draft.
Since we're talking fantasy, obviously world building is such an important piece of your writing. So I want to know, when it comes to world building, what do you like most and what do you like least? So Hafsah, we'll start with you.
I particularly love world building, and I think it has to do with my design background and how I look at everything through this like visual lens. And I was actually thinking about it the other day, and I was like, when I'm putting together a design, I'm usually trying to see how I can evoke as many senses as I can with that one piece of work, with that one graphic. And so I try to do the same in my writing, where I'm like looking at the world through the eyes of my character. It's not like just building the world, like saying there's trees here, or it's not just the landscape of it, but how it feels to that character. And then especially when I have multiple characters and they're really different, like being able to explain and explore the world through all of their different eyes kind of gives it a better, it fleshes out the world more, but it's also so much fun because what one character sees as like green and fun and exciting, another will be grumpy about and be like, oh no, it's too sunny, I just don't like it here anymore. And so it's not just the world building that ends up happening, but also like the characters get fleshed out as well. And so it's just, I don't know, I find it very fun.
All right, Kiersten, what about you? What do you like about world building, and then what do you dislike about it?
See, I'm the opposite. I'm not a visual person at all. My books are words. I know a lot of authors see their books play out. My books are words. They're always words. People ask for character descriptions, and I'm like, well, what do you think they look like? Because I don't know. And so for me, what I like the most about world building is details, is the characters, discovering the world by how the characters act, by how they engage and interact with what's happening around them. So I like doing things like that, pulling from history, pulling from real world things, and turning them, reclaiming them, turning them into something powerful and magical and wonderful. Yeah, my biggest, oh, I hate describing things. I hate it. I have a critique partner, and she'll read my books and she'll be like, what does the room look like? What are they wearing? What does it smell like? What are they eating? And I'm like, oh, I don't care. But that is also something that I'm proud of, because anytime you find a good description in one of my books, I've had to work very, very hard at that. And it's not something that comes easy to me. So when I do have books that people praise for, being really descriptive and vivid, thank you. I worked really hard.
Gabrielle, what about you? Do you like all things world building, or do you have anything you dislike?
I like to write fantasy that's hooked into history one place or another. And this is as much because I'm interested in finding the magic in lived experience as it is that I don't want to have to go out and make things up entirely by myself. Having historical research to react to helps to sort of germinate the ideas, which I find really useful. I love doing the sort of reading that gets my world building done, because it at a certain point it becomes as easy as like, oh, what am I psyched about in the reading that I'm doing? The problem with that is I think in some ways novelists are professional enthusiasts, right? Like it's our job to be like, yo, there's this really cool thing that I want to tell you about. And the issue is when you spend the requisite amount of time in research and world development, there are things that you've developed so that you understand the wiring underneath the panel that the reader does not need to and should not know. And so my least favorite thing about world building is waking up one morning and finding that all the writing that I did for the last week is just me explaining stuff to myself that I now have to cut. That's no fun.
How about you, Julia?
Well, so sort of the opposite maybe of Kiersten. I'm very, very visual. So with most of my books, I start with Pinterest, and I build these like huge, elaborate Pinterest boards in order to give myself like kind of ideas for both the setting so that I can visualize it, and also like what the characters might look like, what the fashions of the world might be, what they might eat, things like that. I mean, some of my Pinterest boards have like 400 pins on them. It's a little out of control. It's probably productive procrastination on my part, but I do love it as a stage. Um, I would say that the hardest part for me is the small details. I'm a pretty lean first drafter. Like my first drafts are like 30 to 40,000 words. And so like there's not a lot of space for like the really elaborate world building I think that fantasy kind of requires to really immerse the reader in the first few drafts. So I kind of feel like I layer it in as I go. And I find that a lot harder, because like if you're layering it in as you go, it can be more difficult sometimes to make sure that the details are consistent. And so I find like, especially when I start reading my second draft or my third draft, that I go back and I read and I'm like, okay, so at this point I said that they did this, or this is the way that this government entity functioned, and then 200 pages later I said that it functioned in a different way. So world building for me, a lot of it is in the editing rather than at the beginning.
Especially in fantasy, and all of your characters had to do some sort of travel or journey, whether it be physical or not. I'm interested to know whether or not you think that you could do the trek that you assigned your characters. So Hafsah, let's start with you.
So basically, We Hunt the Flame is a quest fantasy where they're going on a quest to retrieve something. And I think I'd If I'm putting myself in the main character's shoes, which is Zafira's shoes, her main problem is that she feels like she has to do everything herself, which is sort of my main problem with everything too. And so once she gets she's never alone in her quest. And so I think I would do particularly okay if I'm going to be surrounded by the others because they're all pretty badass and okay with what they're doing. So if I wasn't able to use Zafira's bow and arrows, I would still survive because somebody would probably protect me. I'd just hide behind them. There's a lot of them, so I'd be fine.
I'm glad you have a plan. Kiersten, how about you?
Guinevere leads with kindness and compassion and understanding, right? She looks at people and not how the world sees them, but looks for points of connection, which is something that I've really tried to build and establish in my own life. I've been a mom my entire adult life, so I definitely have that. But the second any quest requires horses, I'm out. Horses are terrifying. They're all just teeth and hooves. If they can fit your shoulder in their mouth, you shouldn't go near them. So no.
Gavriel, how about you? Could you head into the underworld, so to speak?
Yeah, so The Way Back is an interesting book for me. It's very personal. At some level, as I mentioned, it begins when the Angel of Death comes walking through town. On some level, it's really a book about how we relate to death. And one of the big underpinnings of the book is a close encounter that I had with death myself not long ago. And in that sense, I think the protagonists of my book, Bluma and Yuhileb, are going on a journey that they might not have chosen to take, that leads them to the house of death itself, and all the way back. And I think there's a certain sense in which I wrote this book because I was already on that journey, and I needed to figure out the way back for myself. So in one sense, whether or not I ever thought I could, I think I already have taken this journey. And in the other, more literal sense, the answer is no, because it sounds hard. And I have chosen a life where I sit in front of a computer and make up stories and drink coffee and eat chocolate chip cookies. So, yes and no, which is the answer that you will most often get when you ask a Jewish novelist a question.
Now, Julia, how about you? Now, first of all, I guess the question is, can you sing? And
Yes.
okay.
Yeah.
And then would you be able to handle what you threw at Cadence and Remy?
I would say so. Ruinsong has less of a physical journey in terms of changing place. The vast majority of the story takes place in a single city, and the characters don't really travel. The main journey is an emotional one for Cadence, where she has to go from this place of real fear of the queen and what the queen might do to her in order to stand up for something or stand against something that she has known from the outset is wrong. And I think I would like to believe that I could make that journey, although the circumstances that were thrown at Cadence in the book are certainly horrible and difficult. I would like to believe about myself that I would be able to sort of stand up for what is right in the end. But I think until you're put in that kind of horrible situation, it's really hard to know how you would come out of it as a person.
Excellent. Thank you guys so much. This has been so cool to talk to you guys. I also want to thank HEC Media and Novel Neighbor. And I do want to remind everyone watching that you can order books through thenovelneighbor.com. And also, I want to remind you that there are lots more Teen Fest events available to watch either on the St. Louis County Library's Facebook page or YouTube. Again, thank you guys so much for talking with us today.